Katerina Yaka watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Yaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionaries Socialist Review for March 24th, 2022. This is Chris Driscoll, and along with me is Rainer Shea. First up on the agenda tonight, the US and NATO allies arm neo-Nazi units in Ukraine as foreign policy elites yearn for Afghan-style insurgency. This comes to us from the Greyzone. Okay, corporate US media and foreign policy hardliners want to create a new Afghanistan in the middle of Europe by flooding Ukraine with weapons. The arms industry is very pleased. Following urgent requests for arms from the Ukrainian government, at least 32 countries have announced their intention to ship billions of dollars in weapons to Ukraine for use against Russian forces. Photographic evidence shows that these weapons have already ended up in the hands of neo-Nazi paramilitaries, units which have already received training and arms the US and from the US and its NATO allies. Underscoring the careless nature of the unprecedented arms shipments, the formerly neutral country of Norway has warned that its government cannot guarantee that the weapons it is sending to Ukraine will not fall into the wrong hands. As corporate media and Reddit forums spin out a rose-colored view of the Ukrainian military's performance, some 20,000 foreign fighters from 52 countries have signed up to join the newly formed International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine. Many are now fleeing back across the Polish border, filled with fear in the face of heavy casualties. All of this builds on 3.8 billion in military aid from the United States to Ukraine, the training of 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers by Canada and the United Kingdom, and a long-standing CIA program aimed at cultivating an anti-Russian insurgency. As Western officials clamor for a long and bloody war against Russia while skirting efforts at negotiation, progressive anti-war voices in Congress like Representative Ro Khanna, who once railed against U.S. sponsorship of Nazism in Ukraine, are now cheerleading massive arms transfers to Kiev.
You know, when it comes to Reddit, that's a notable part of the information war right now, because this last day, the subreddit Gen Z Dong was censored heavily. They quarantined it, so to speak, by making it so everybody
What is
sees,
Gen Z Dong? What is Gen Z Dong about?
It's about Marxism-Leninism.
Oh, okay.
And exactly the kind of Marxism-Leninism we espouse. So naturally, it garnered lots of negative attention because for some reason, Reddit in particular is infamous, at least among the more learned people, for promoting aggressive pro-US agendas when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to world issues. There's these jokes. I think we talked about them, about how Redditors have only one joke, and it involves social credit. So
yeah,
it's so insipid, so shallow, and they're pushing out alternative voices.
Well, Reddit has all kinds of various groups, right? So, I mean, some of the groups are good, some of them are bad. But from what I understand from you now, Reddit, the company or whatever it is actually banning some groups on Reddit. And I already know that there are a lot of Reddit groups that are pro-Nazi, pro-Ukraine, despicable, in other words. So, yeah, that's bad news. That's really bad news. Well, this is an interesting article. I only gave a very short highlight from the article from Greyzone. So there's a lot more to it, and our viewers should check out the link that we put down for this article underneath this video, and read the rest of it, because there's a lot of good stuff in there. Greyzone, they did a really good job on this, explaining how the US-Nato, I just call it one thing, US-NATO. They call it two things, US and NATO, but it's really just one thing. It's US-NATO. And US-NATO has been arming these neo-Nazis forever, and at least for the last 8 years, helping them carry out a brutal, genocidal onslaught attack against the people of the Donbass, especially in the newly independent People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. So killing up to 14,000 people, according to the UN. So I'm pretty sure it's probably more like 25,000 people if the UN says it's 14,000. Since the US runs the UN or has pretty much captured the UN, its information is not all that hot. Okay, next on the list. To win the masses, revolutionaries must properly study their conditions.
This comes from an article I encountered this last week that was repudiating the problematic ideas of Che Guevara when it comes to waging war. Because even though Che wrote this guide to guerrilla warfare that has been used to good use by thousands of guerrillas over the decades, he also carried out Focoism, which was the strategy for going into a foreign country that one isn't necessarily part of and expecting to spark a revolution just by having a good cadre. But history has shown us that no matter how good your cadre is, if they aren't part of that local area, if they don't intimately know the conditions, then they're going to encounter a dissonance between what they think they should do and what the masses mandate they should do. And you see this all over the world, not necessarily even from armies that are from foreign lands to where they're trying to gain a foothold within, though obviously we see that with the US in Afghanistan, the US in all these places. I'm also talking about homegrown guerrilla armies that adopt stances which are out of step with what the masses need. Like how in the Philippines, the Maoist guerrillas stick to this decades-old, outdated position about how they only need to ally with the rural population. They shouldn't reach out to the urban proletariat, and that's handicapped them. We saw this with the Gonzaloists in Peru, who imposed an arbitrary model of governance on these local indigenous communities, trying to replace indigenous models that had worked for millennia. So being dogmatic, not willing to compromise for the conditions, and this helped create indigenous opposition to them, which helped undermine their guerrilla project. You can think of more examples of these, including the example of Che's own Focoist project in Bolivia, which failed because it was out of step with what the conditions would have necessitated. And we need to learn this lesson as we proceed within our range. We need to avoid this kind of hubris.
Yes, all good points. All good points. I look at this a little bit differently. We've always, for a long time, we've talked about the peasantry and the working class as though they were separate. In fact, the peasantry today, or what used to be called the peasantry, is the rural proletariat. And revolutionaries, especially in very rural countries where agriculture is the main type of production for most of the country, it is important for revolutionary forces to focus on that rural proletariat. However, there's also an urban and suburban proletariat, and you've got to focus there too. The Cubans did this brilliantly. They focused both on the urban and suburban proletariat, where in the final days of the revolution, those two elements were crucial in helping to bring about the revolution. And they focused on the rural proletariat. That's the way to do it. Cubans are a good example of this, and these examples that you brought up, including some of Che's adventurist stuff, turned out not so good because he was operating on a false premise. So very good points there. Next on the list, the Washington benefits from Ukraine's misfortune. This comes from the Global Times. It's an editorial by the Global Times from March 24th, 2022. And so very timely, right up to the second, so to speak. Anyway, here's what they say, if I can get to it. By March 24th, the Russian-Ukraine conflict has lasted 1 month. All peace-loving people in the world hope this bloody conflict, which could have been avoided, could end soon. However, the US and NATO, which hold the key to resolving the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, have made no practical moves to end the war. Instead, they are still intensifying contradictions and escalating confrontation, creating obstacles for negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. US President Joe Biden left for Europe on Wednesday, where he will attend the NATO summit, the G7 summit, and the European Council meeting. According to media reports, Biden will work with European allies to coordinate next stage military assistance to Ukraine and will announce a new round of sanctions against Russia. On the 1 month mark of the conflict, Biden carried out his intensive diplomatic offensive in Europe, yet nothing on his agenda is about adding or yet everything on his agenda is about adding fuel to the fire. That's kind of mistranslated there, but the meaning is that he's adding more fuel to the fire. When touching upon Biden's European trip, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that there will be hard days ahead in Ukraine as this war will not end easily or rapidly. This is not so much a judgment by the U.S., but a carefully guided direction by Washington. Washington wishes the war will not end so that it can maximize the use of the conflict to gain geopolitical value from it. In other words, it is seeking to benefit from Ukraine's misfortune. Because of this, the US and Europe may seem to appear close, but their substantive differences are deepening. While Washington is obsessed with delaying Russia-Ukraine negotiations, Europe anti-war voices, Europe wants security and stability. There are emerging anti-war voices in Europe, and these voices include disapproval towards Washington's arms delivery to Ukraine. More and more Europeans realize that blindly sending arms to Ukraine is heading towards the opposite direction of the security goals they pursue. In addition, the result of long-term extreme sanctions must be that the US gets rich. Europe pays the bill and Ukraine bleeds. Washington can't hide these petty ideas. Also, because of this, Biden has to stabilize Europe when it has wavering intentions. It is not difficult to imagine that Washington will put out the transatlantic friend, will pull out the transatlantic friendship, democratic alliance, and other small cards from its pockets and distribute them to friends as passes to the World VIP Club, using the illusory honor to extract high dues. Washington also exerts strong pressure on neutral countries that don't join the club, criticizing India for being shaky on the one hand and sensationalizing China's threat to peace on the other. Isn't this a typical mafia approach? As the saying goes, it is up to the doer to undo the knot. The Russian-Ukraine conflict is the result of the intensification of the conflict between the US and Russia. And the key to the problem lies in the hands of the US. If Washington really wants the hard days of Ukrainian people not to continue, then why did it choose to coordinate with Europe to send weapons to Ukraine and sanction Russia and refuse to talk directly with Russia? The answer is clear. The US does not want real peace talks. That's why one can see such an absurd scenario, despite knowing where the way out is for the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Washington is still desperately wiping the sign which says no thoroughfare at the end of a blind alley.
A lot of thoughts are going through my mind. One of them is this conversation that I had a few weeks ago with a professor at my university, and I think it was one of the more constructive ones I've encountered when it comes to academics in terms of courses, forums pertaining to the Russia-Ukraine issue, because the conclusion he came to after being confronted with my information about how the Ukrainian regime has committed human rights abuses and threatens ethnic cleansing against the Donbass People's Republic and the Lugansk People Republic is, yes, this is a fascist regime that threatens a humanitarian disaster, but is Russia's intervention how to fix that. And it's definitely a more reasonable take than I think you'd find from most academics, but it was not willing to take the extra leap of going against everything the cultural hegemony says about this issue by outright saying Russia is in the right. No one wants to admit that.
Exactly.
And it's all part of this justification the U.S. has, or that it's manufacturing for its sabotage of diplomacy. I wonder what the rationale is for delaying talks, even though the U.S. says it cares so much about Ukraine's people. And I think it pertains to this blame shifting agenda.
Yeah. And this comes to us from the Saker blog, Saker, I don't know how you pronounce that, from March 23rd, 2022. Units of the Russian armed forces continue to destroy, hold on, let me switch this view here a second. There we go. Units of the Russian armed forces continue to destroy units of the 54th Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Currently, they are fighting for the capture of Lovka, the grouping of troops of the Donetsk People's Republic, having completed clearing of Verkhnetorovsky from the nationalists, continue to pursue the retreating units of the 25th Airborne Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and took control of Muthovka railway station. During the night, 3 tanks, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, and 6 all-terrain vehicles were destroyed in this area. On the evening of March 22nd, high-precision, long-range, sea-based weapons struck an arms depot in Orshev, 14 kilometers north of Rovno city. As a result of the strike, a large deposit of weapons and military equipment of the Ukrainian troops, including those received from Western countries, was destroyed. Operational tactical Army aviation and missile troops hit 97 military assets of the Ukrainian armed forces, among them 2 launchers, 1 transport load vehicle of Torchka-U tactical missile system in an industrialized zone on the northern outskirts of Kiev, 8 anti-aircraft missile systems, including 6 Buk M1, 1 S-300, and 1 OSA combat vehicle, 10 command posts, 8 field artillery guns, as well as 3 artillery reconnaissance stations of NATO manufacture. The Russian air defense means shot down 1 Su-24 near Izyum city, 16 Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles in the air, including 3 Bayraktar TB2 near Roshin, Karashev, and Maxim Gorky. The group of night hunters consisting of Ka-52 and Mi-28N helicopters destroyed 8 tanks, 5 infantry fighting vehicles, and armed personnel carriers, 9 vehicles and towing trucks, 3 permanent fire position, and 7 field artillery and mortars during night strikes. In total, 184 aircraft and helicopters of the Ukrainian Air Force, 246 unmanned aerial vehicles, 189 anti-aircraft missile systems, 1,558 tanks and other armored vehicles, 156 multiple launch rocket systems, 624 field artillery and mortars, as well as 1,354 units of special military vehicles were destroyed during the operation. And then there's a comment by a guy named Amaranth. The next analysis I post with a great caveat. I cannot confirm this as being correct with all the T's crossed and the I's dotted. The only reason that I post it is that it reflects what we've seen so far in terms of Russian troop movements and progress. This is one coherent explanation that could help those that are not experts in watching military movements, weapons and strategies and optics of the war, and maybe we can do away with the meme and myths of Russia is bogged down, Russia is moving too slowly and similar. Really interesting analysis from Friendly Anon on Poll. Full quote. Ukraine spent several years preparing a 300,000 army to take Donbass in a 1 to 2 day blitz. And Ukrainian army groups were deployed across Kharkiv and Kiev areas in preparation for active defense, knowing Russia could respond aggressively to a massive assault on the Donbass region. The operation was planned, taught, and supplied by Western governments. And the countless trips of Western politicians to Moscow prior to the war were intended to slow down Moscow's preparations for a counteroffensive. None of those political visits contained any clear talking points. They were just there to win time. Russia knew about the Donbass preparations years in advance and constructed a preemptive war plan to wage war with the benefit of having the intense initiative instead of waging a reactionary war. Knowing that breaking through NATO-designed defenses the conventional way wouldn't work, Russia instead used the tactic of mobile groups whose primary goal was to rush B, whatever that means, in quotes, rush B, bypassing fortified Ukrainian defensive lines and abandoning any military vehicles that malfunctioned or ran out of fuel along the way, since speed was more important than size. The Rush B units had to quickly take control of vital Ukrainian supply and command nodes behind enemy lines to make Ukrainian tactics for active defense unfeasible, forcing Ukrainian units to redirect their attention inwards into their own territory instead of facing a Russian advance. These RU mobile groups were essentially kamikaze units with a high likelihood of being destroyed within days, given that they dispersed themselves deep into enemy territory in small numbers. This is why Russia's largest casualties happened during the first days of the war, and why the MSM was talking about Russia running out of fuel and supplies on the third day of the war. They mistook the Rush B units for Russia's primary advancing forces. Russia has no intention of taking Kiev, but it has every intention to harass Kiev to divert attention. Pretty interesting stuff, huh?
Well, it speaks to how Russia is actually winning the war, which feels so odd to say because in these last couple days, we've really been hearing definitive sounding statements from the US media saying the opposite. The Atlantic just published an article simply titled, "Ukraine is Winning." And we're hearing similar things from all these other places.
Yeah. The propaganda war.
There's two sides to the story.
Yeah, the propaganda war is not the real war. The real war is taking place in Ukraine, not over the TV and airwaves. The Americans are frustrated. They're frustrated because they know at this point the American people will not put up with U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. And that's really frustrating to them because they are losing the war hands down. Ukraine, the Ukrainian military is putting up a good fight, but even with whatever it was, 3.2 billion dollars in military aid from the United States, lethal weapons, and 38 other countries pouring lethal weapons into Ukraine, they don't have what it takes to fight the Russian army. The Russian army is winning hands down. So, next on the list and final, Renegade interviews Michael Hudson, Sanctions and the Blowback. And this comes to us also from the Saker blog. However, it was originally broadcast on RT, the RT network. Renegade, I guess, is a show on the RT network. And of course, Michael Hudson is the premier American Marxist economist. So he has a lot to say about this stuff. Anyway, Ross is the name of the guy who's interviewing. Ross says, Michael, sanctions is all we hear now. We're sanctioning people. The West sanctioned people back to the Stone Age. What are the unintended consequences of sanctions? Michael Hudson. Well, one is to serve very much like a protective tariff on the sanctioned country. For instance, when America made sanctions on European trade with Russia, Lithuania dutifully stopped exporting cheese to Russia. Well, the result is that Russia set up its own cheese sector, and now it's self-sufficient in cheese. If you sanction a country, you force it to become more self-reliant, and across the board, from agriculture to dairy products to technology, Russia is forced to become more self-reliant and at the same time to depend much more on trade with China for the things that it is still not self-reliant in. So America is bringing about exactly the opposite of what it intended. It's hopeless to somehow isolate Russia and then be able to go after China without Russia. And instead, what it's doing is integrating the Eurasian core, Russia and China, exactly the policy that Henry Kissinger warned against doing all the way back to Mackinder. And of course, Mackinder is a British author from the early part of the 20th century, like 1910 or thereabouts, who wrote a book about this geopolitical strategy of winning the world island, what he called the world island. Anyway, Eurasia is the world island. Russia and China could be the whole world center. That's what the fight is all about. Well, the American sanctions are driving Russia and China together, and America has gone to China and said, please don't support Russia. It most recently on Monday, March 14th, Jake Sullivan came out and told China, we will sanction countries that break our sanctions against Russia. And basically Russia said, fine, we'll just break off all the trade between East and West now, and the East, Eurasia is pretty much self-sufficient. The West is not self-sufficient since it began to industrialize. And it is heavily dependent on Russia, not only for oil and gas, but palladium and many raw materials. So the sanctions are ending up driving a wedge between European countries. Ross says, don't people who apply these sanctions think this through? Are they so short-sighted that they don't understand that these sanctions are going to build further capacity within Russia, push Russia further towards China, make that economic alliance concrete, and ultimately, you're not going to be able to keep the lights on in Europe, all the while underestimating the fact that from a food security point of view, take the UK, for example, a net importer of food, not appreciating the fact that, for instance, Russia, Ukraine, they create 25%, a quarter of all wheat annually. The estimation this year is 102 million tons, Russia and China wheat. Don't people realize that there is going to be a massive knock-on effect, Michael Hudson? Yes, they do realize it. Yes, they've thought it through. I worked with these people for more than 50 years. Who are these people, Ross asks. Michael Hudson. The neocons, basically, the people who are in charge of U.S. foreign policy. Victoria Nuland and her husband, Robert Kagan. The people that President Biden has appointed all around him, from Blinken to Sullivan and right down the line. They are all basically urging people around the new American century. They're the people who said America can run the whole world and create its own reality. And yes, they know that this is going to cause enormous problems for Germany. They know that not only will it block the energy that Germany and Italy and other countries in Europe need through their oil and gas, but also it'll block the use of gas for fertilizer, upping their fertilizer production and decreasing their food production. They look at this and they say, how can America gain from all of this? There's always a way of gaining that something, of gaining what something looks to be bad. Well, one way they'll gain is oil prices are going way up. And that benefits the United States, whose foreign policy is based very largely on oil and gas. The oil industry controls most of the world's oil trade, and that explains a lot of the U.S. diplomacy. This is a fight to lock the world energy trade into control by U.S. companies, including not only Iran and Venezuela, but also excluding not only Iran and Venezuela, but also excluding Russia.
They're sanctioning themselves. They're creating their own crisis.
Yeah, but the powerful people, they're making big bucks off this. You know, like the owners of oil companies, owners of wheat companies that will gain by the fact that wheat will go sky high through the roof because they're not getting Russian wheat anymore, or Ukrainian wheat. You know, they don't give a fuck if people starve or if people have to pay $10 a gallon for gasoline. They're gaining huge profits out of this. So that's all they really care about. I mean, they're destroying the power of America through doing this, but they're making big profits off it.
And all that they can say in response is that this is worth it for freedom. That's the whole narrative that's pushed, if not explicitly, then implicitly by our cultural hegemony. It's what all the ideas we're told on this issue try to lead us to believe when it comes to the consequences of these actions.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, this is strengthening Russia. Russia has some short-term pain out of this too, no doubt. But Europe has much greater pain. So the Americans are punishing their own allies most. They're punishing their own allies much more than Russia, much more than they're punishing Russia. And in the end, Russia will come out way stronger because of this, because they will ally more and more with the global South, with Iran, and with China, and they will rely more on themselves for many industries. I mean, already look at it. Hell, they closed down McDonald's, right? All of a sudden, there's like 684 outlets of Uncle Vinya. Uncle Vinya's a new hamburger joint made with all Russian hamburger or Russian stuff. It's the same thing as McDonald's, except it's Russian now. The idiots who own McDonald's just gave up an enormous business and just gave it over to the Russian government. And so Russia's, laughing all the way to the bank. They're doing this over and over and over again because there are 1,000 companies that did business, American companies and European companies that did business in Russia, and now they're not. And Russia's just taking all those businesses over, starting them up again, starting them anew, starting them as Russian businesses. It's just crazy. I mean, the stupidity of it is beyond imagination. But there are people who are making huge profits off this, like the oil, owners of oil and the owners of wheat and so forth and so on. They're making big profits off this. The farmers aren't doing too good, but the owners of agrobiz and the owners of oil industry are doing great. It's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy. Anyway, that's our show for tonight. And I want to thank you, Rainer, for your contribution. Thank all of our viewers for tuning in, and please tune in again next week when we will have another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. Until then, I bid you a sweet adieu.